Welcome to this first session of our sustainable financing for soil remediation projects in China and beyond, our virtual symposium. And before we start today's session, I'd just like to give a quick housekeeping announcement. So as you can see, this event is in a webinar mode, and we do have simultaneous interpretation available, both in English and Chinese. To fully use that function, you can move your mouse to the bottom of the screen. There's a globe button, and you click on that, and you can select the audio channel that you would like to listen to the event in, English or Chinese. Now, please also note that this meeting is being recorded, and we will post the recordings and slides to the event page at IISD.org. So you will be able to access all recordings and slides after this session. To ask questions for the panelists today, please make sure to use the chat box function or the Q&A functions. And then we'll address those questions at the end of our session, the Q&A session. So with that, I would like to welcome Natalie Bernasconi, the Executive Director of IISD Europe, to give the opening remarks for this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joe. Distinguished speakers, colleagues, friends, good morning, good afternoon, and also good evening. On behalf of the co-organizers of this virtual forum, the International Institute for Sustainable Development, IISD, and the Norwegian Institute for Water Research, NIVA, I would like to welcome you all to this 3-day seminar on soil remediation. We hope you will enjoy it and continue to stay with us for the next few days. Today on the panel and in the audience, we have senior government policymakers, leading industry practitioners, and finance experts, all gathering to share their perspectives and thoughts on the urgent topic of the protection and restoration of soil. Soil provides ecosystem services for us, filtering our water, providing a habitat for billions of organisms, supporting the growth of plants, recycling raw materials, and mitigating climate change. Healthy soil is vital, of course, for food and feed production, but our activities have hugely damaged and contaminated soil, and often the level and extent of contamination remains unknown, coming to light many years after the contaminating activity has taken place. Our soils have accumulated large amounts of contaminants from mining, from waste, and from intensive agricultural and industrial activity, to name just a few. For example, a 2014 government study found nearly 20% of China's farmland was contaminated. But of course, China is not alone. Soil contamination is a huge issue across the globe, and new contaminations continue to be discovered. Just here in Switzerland, where I live, a large-scale soil pollution was discovered in Lausanne, near Geneva, just earlier this month. An area of about 20 square kilometers was found to be contaminated with high levels of dioxin, probably due to the operations of an incineration plant in the 80s. This was unknown for many years. So working together with our Norwegian and Chinese partners, IISD has been looking at some of the challenges preventing us from effectively carrying out full-scale remediation and rehabilitation projects. We found important bottlenecks in the structures and legal frameworks governing soil remediation, as well as gaps in the technical capacity. But one of the biggest challenges for soil remediation remains its financing. To tackle this challenge, we have looked at a variety of financing instruments that could help address the finance gap. We will be hearing about all of these issues over the next few days. The symposium will begin with a session focusing on the policies governing soil remediation projects. Soil management practices of governments around the world vary, of course, and you will hear about different perspectives from policymakers and non-governmental experts. Tomorrow at the same hour, we will have a second panel of experts presenting the industry position and examining technical challenges occurring in soil remediation projects. At the final session on Thursday, leading experts from the financial industry will look at the same issues from the financing perspective, including how to use innovative instruments to leverage limited public financing to mobilize the sometimes untapped potential from private sources. Now, before I hand the floor to our moderator, Ms. Liu Hongqiao, I would like to thank the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, whose generous contribution made this event and our early research on this topic possible. I would also like to thank our longtime partner, the Chinese Academy of Environment Planning, as well as China's Ministry of Ecology and Environment for their continued support from the very early days of this project. I would also like to thank our co-organizer, NIVA, as well as other partners, in particular, the Cicero Center for International Climate and Environmental Research, and the International Institute of Green Finance of the Central University of Finance and Economics in Beijing. Without further ado, please allow me to introduce Ms. Liu Hongqiao. We are very excited to have her moderating this three-day symposium. Ms. Liu is an independent journalist and consultant based in Paris. Her work primarily focuses on environment, biodiversity, energy, and climate. And she was the youngest recipient of the China Environmental Press Award founded by the China Dialogue and The Guardian. Her soil contamination report back in 2014 triggered continuous nationwide or civil society movements seeking transparency and accountability on environmental health, as well as national policy reform in China. Last week, she gave a TED Talk in Edinburgh about China's role in curbing climate change. So you're all welcome to check that out. Hongqiao, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Natalie, for the very kind introduction to your very special address. I would also love to use the opportunity to thank the co-organizers, the IISD and the Norwegian Institute for Water Research to create this very unique opportunity for us to gather together to discuss this very important issue, but sometimes overlooked in our time. And my personal experience, as Natalie just mentioned, was dated back to 2012, 2014. That was 7 years ago already. And I am glad since then a lot of issues have been addressed, tackled, and a lot of innovations has been going on. And in this particular session, the session 1, we will focus on the governance perspective on soil remediation projects in China, in the US, and the EU. And as you might have already read from the program, soil management practices of governments around the world seem to be rather fragmented, and we have very little governmental reporting that considers the soil remediation in their climate mitigation strategies. And here we have 3 very distinguished guests from China, the US, and the EU, who have very rich experience on the ground and dealing with government partners in each of these jurisdictions. And they will come here to share with their unique approach on how to carry out such projects in different countries and share with their perspectives. And of course, the challenges and the ideas for future. So I would just I will have to explain to you that we have scheduled 3 speakers Professor Dong Zhanfang and Dietmar Müller, Mr. Müller, and Mr. Steve Wolfson from the US. And due to some technical issues, we will have Mr. Müller to speak first. And to all the speakers, I will give you a reminder like this when you have only 90 seconds left. You will have 10 minutes in total to share your perspectives, then we'll move to discussion. So with that in mind, I will introduce you to Mr. Müller, who works with Environmental Agency Austria, EAA, and has very rich experience in the national on the ground. He has been helping setting a few standards in the EU level and also at the country level. Since September 2017, he's the General Secretary to the Common Forum on Contaminated Land in Europe, and the ICCL, the European and the Global Network of Policy Advisors and the Regulators in Contaminated Land Management. And Mr. Müller will give us an overview of contaminated land in Europe, the status quo on governing and financing soil and site remediation in Europe, and of course the role of private and public finance. Mr. Müller will express himself in English, so as the colleague suggested earlier, Chinese speakers can switch to the interpretation for translation. The floor is yours, Mr. Müller. Such a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much for the nice introduction. Welcome to all the attendees also from the heart of Europe, from Vienna. So I'm glad here to involve myself to your discussions and representing Common Forum on Contaminated Land in Europe. To explain Common Forum, it's important to recognize that me as a person in Common Forum, we are an informal network of all the European countries involved in having soil remediation programs. So I'm not the European Commission, I'm not representing Austria. I'm General Secretary to Common Forum, and that's why I'm here. And reading the governance issue, it's simply maybe forefront to say that governance is something different than government. Governance really involves all actors of society to look for improving our environmental behaviors. Nevertheless, Common Forum, as said, we are in place since 25 years. It's a network of policymakers, regulators. It's Europe, it's beyond the European Union. And there is a secretariat since more than 13 years, and the secretariat is now with me, now with you. What is it to discuss governance and financing in Europe? That's rather diverse, as also maybe the map expresses. There is always to remember that there is a European Union level aspect. And then there are national aspects for the member countries, and there could be even regional aspects if there are regional programs. Briefly summarized, the common denominators we refer to is that, first of all, pollution prevention, obviously, is the first priority. And it's much more effective than spending money to remediate. In second place, of course, it's agreed the polluter pays principle. If there is a liable polluter, then he should be made liable to pay for remediation. In a general term of environmental management, we are looking out for sustainably managing natural resources, and stakeholder involvement is key to all our actions, or should be key. Well, besides the common denominators, it's then to watch out for what are the member countries doing, how do we make it work on the country level. Governance involving all actors. Simply then also to give an example is that Common Forum also co-works with the industry network here in Europe, which is under the abbreviation of NICOL. And simply showing this outcome of a common discussion, which was a position paper, a common position paper of European industries and the European regulators on remediation. You can find it on the respective web page indicated. No need to go further. If you're interested, please have your look. Legislative frames, as expressed before, there is the European level. I would put the highlight on the Environmental Liability Directive and the Industrial Emissions Directive. The Industrial Emissions Directive, really looking for big installations and looking for pollution prevention, but as well having articles on soil remediation and restoring to the baseline conditions before the industrial activities. The Environmental Liability Directive, on the other hand, in its idea, was really making then the operators liable and should have been an incentive for the insurance sector to come in with new products to finance. Below the European legislation, then there's the national legislation comes in, and that's simply the examples what would count here in Austria. It's very much the Water Act, which has the basic background that we get all our drinking water from groundwater, and so it's very important to keep it clean. In looking where we stand for financing soil and site remediation, that's the overview of the state we are. With the new European Commission, since end of 2019, we have a new program, which is called the European Green Deal. And in there, the Just Transition Fund, which creates new co-funding mechanisms for environment in large. So in total, this will be half a trillion euro, which should be released for environmental affairs and just transition. In the member states then, if you look for financing, it's of course in the first row, if there is a polluter, the polluter pays principle should account. If not available, then there should be a defined chain of liability, which goes down usually from the owner until the end, and then the end would be, for example, the Republic of Austria. If it's an orphan site, then that's the last bullet. So quite common are, of course, and necessary programs on orphan sites and historical pollution. We also, and you will be likely aware, we have even some contamination from the medieval ages, so several centuries ago. What is also quite common is sectoral funding programs, which are run in a public-private partnership. So the origin was for the petrol stations and small chemical laundries. That's something you can find in a lot of countries here around in Europe. And I would say that one very important player and key is also the real estate sector in itself, in their interest of brownfield redevelopment. And then it comes very much too close to have a clear picture on the value of land in a particular environmental setting. Finally, that's my last slide. Just to be clear about how the shares are. It comes back to what was on one of the first slides. Europe is diverse. So the different nations you see there have a different ratio in public and private investments for contamination remediation. There are some like Norway, which are really dominantly privately funded, whereas in specific countries as well, European funds since a long time play a major role, and national funds are common to all the countries, I would say. Herewith, that's it from my side. Hope it was informative, staying available for questions and further discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Muller. Yes, dear audience, participants, if you have any questions in regard to any of the speakers, to the question, anything that they have very quickly mentioned, but not yet go to details, please raise your questions. You can type the question in the Q&A session. We will pick up the questions and adjust to them in the later part of this discussion. And thank you again, Mr. Muller. And now we're going to have Professor Dong Zhanfeng, Vice Director of the Department of Environmental Policy of Chinese Academy of Environmental Planning, attached to the Chinese Ministry of Environmental Protection in China. Dong Zhanfeng is mainly engaged in environmental strategy and plan environmental policy. He is a senior environmental policy consultant expert for a number of international agencies, such as UNDP, UNEP, ADB, a number of them. And I will not name each of them. He also serves on the council or committee of a few international domestic academic groups like the Chinese Society of Environmental Economics. He has a lot of experience, not only on the ground, but also at policy level. He has been advising, giving recommendations on environmental policies for Chinese central government as well as local government departments. So I'm very, very glad that Professor Dong Zhanfeng can join us. He will share with us an overview of the public policies in China in regards to soil remediation and his observation of the field reflections on financing soil remediation projects in China, the challenge, innovations, and the trends ahead. Professor Dong Zhanfeng will speak in Chinese. So for non-Chinese speakers, please click the interpretation button at the bottom of the Zoom bar to make sure you receive the interpretation correctly. 董占峰教授，现在您可以开始发言了，谢谢。
Professor Dong Zhanfeng, the floor is yours.
Thank
you very much. It's my great pleasure to join today's symposium. I'm going to talk about the situation of soil remediation in China, the major problems and challenges, and the future direction. Time is limited, so I will be brief. The Chinese government attaches great importance to soil remediation and environmental control in recent years. A lot of powerful and robust measures have been taken, including the soil pollution prevention and law. This law has been promulgated and released. And second, there is an action plan for the soil pollution prevention and control. And this action plan promotes advancements of soil remediation, and there is overall planning for soil pollution prevention and control. And now there is the 14th five-year plan for environmental protection and conservation. Many effective policies have been released. For example, the local governments are encouraged to establish a special fund for soil pollution prevention and control, and advanced technologies that can be utilized to resolve soil pollution issues. In particular, it is encouraged to establish a soil pollution monitoring system, and there is a capacity building and database development initiative. In the past, the soil pollution prevention and control was pretty slow, and in recent years, many efforts have been made to catch up with soil pollution prevention and control, and to make up for the weaknesses. And that's the update of the current situation of the soil remediation and soil pollution prevention and control. Now let's look at the major challenges and the problems. I think there is lack of policy supply, and the major measures are on soil risk prevention and control. But we have to utilize the market-oriented approach to conduct the soil remediation and the soil pollution prevention and control. That's the first problem. The second, about legislation. Yeah, there is the principle of a polluter pays, but we have to clarify the responsibilities and liabilities of the polluters. And also we have to think about how to divide their responsibilities and the liabilities. And in terms of the regulatory capacity, it is not very advanced. We have to conduct the capacity building and for the regulators. And I think we have to strengthen technical capacity for solute pollution, monitoring and supervision. And thirdly, technology-wise, there are some challenges. There is huge regional difference in China, and there is a pollution from industry, agriculture, and industries generate different pollutants, and the pollution from agriculture is also different in different areas and regions in China. That's why there should be a solute remediation system which needs a strong technical support, and that technical capability is not strong enough. And fourthly, there are challenges in public involvement and public oversight over solute pollution prevention and control. And this work in China has a pretty late start. So these are the key challenges in terms of the governance. And next, what we should do is to implement the solute pollution prevention and control law. Now we have to get this law implemented on the ground. And second, we have to strengthen risk control, in particular for industrial pollution. We have to establish the industrial pollution prevention and control system and capabilities. And thirdly, the solute ecosystem, the solute pollution monitoring and surveillance system must be in place with a greater capacity. There should be the monitoring and the surveillance and platforms empowered by data. And then the platform can better monitor the solute pollution. And fourthly, we have to strengthen the role of a market. According to the solute pollution prevention and control law, local governments must establish the solute remediation and pollution prevention and control funds at the provincial level. And we have to make better use of financial instruments, and there should be greater debt and tax concession. And there should be greater tax concession measures. And number 5 is about the local monitoring and surveillance capacities. That capacity must be further strengthened. Number 6 is that we have to develop a solute remediation system by sector and by types of pollution and pollutants. So this is where we should move forward. That's all from me for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dong. We actually have scheduled 10 minutes, but the Professor Dong is very sharp, very on point. We can leave the more in-depth discussion in the moderated discussion and the Q&A session. And attendees, participants, please start to type your questions if you have any. We will be happy to address any of your questions in the later part of this panel. And yes, now I will invite Mr. Steve Watson from US EPA to join us to share with us the experiences of the Superfund, among a lot of other things in the US. Mr. Watson is a senior attorney of the US Environmental Protection Agency, known as the EPA. He handles international law issues regarding climate change. Steve has represented EPA at negotiations of the Rotterdam Plural Informed Consent Convention, the World Trade Organization, litigation and has developed and delivered environmental law training in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. Steve has been an invited speaker on Chinese environmental law and other environmental governance topics at the World Justice Forum in Hague, the World Bank, among other institutes. And we have great pleasure to have Steve to come to us, to join the panel, to share with us the experience. Steve, you have 10 minutes, pace yourself well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank the organizers for pulling this together. It's good to see old friends on this event. I'm not going to cover all of my slides given the time, but I do want to run through some of the highlights. So will you all be able to put the slides up on the screen, or should I do that from here?
Hi, Steve. Yeah, I'll do that.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. So on the second slide is a overview of the main theme, of course, and we've heard already that prevention is better than cleanup, because cleanup is very expensive and can take a lot of time. I will talk about two of our laws in the US, one for preventing contaminated sites, soil contamination, and another for cleaning up. On the slide 3, we see the major US laws in this area. The Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, which we call RCRA, R-C-R-A, or RCRA. That is primarily about controlling hazardous waste and preventing the creation of new contaminated sites. The second law in the middle there is the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, which we call CERCLA, or it's also sometimes known as the Superfund law. And then we mentioned that most US states have their own laws. We have 50 states, and each state has their own law, or most states have their own law similar to CERCLA. Those laws are used for the smaller and the less complex contaminated site cleanups. The next slide, this is a basic principle in our system. Prevention is better than cleanup. Cleanup is very expensive. It costs a lot of money to clean up the soil at most sites and to clean up the water at the site or near the site or below the site. Cleanup also takes a long time. It can take years to figure out how bad the problem is and to select the remedy, and then to go through the technical fixes to address the contamination. So coming back to the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, RCRA, it embodies this idea that prevention is better than cleanup. It regulates hazardous waste, solid waste, and underground storage tanks, where we've had a lot of problems of leaks from underground storage tanks creating soil contamination. The parties that are regulated under RCRA are the generators of waste, the transporters of waste, and treatment, storage, and disposable facilities. RCRA includes a permit program for treatment, storage, and disposal of waste, and it forms what we call a cradle-to-grave system for managing hazardous waste. The next slide it simply makes the point that to avoid creating Superfund sites, highly contaminated sites, you need a safe place to take the contaminated stuff, the waste, the hazardous waste. In the US, some of the most highly contaminated sites are old landfills from before the RCRA law was put in place. But now under RCRA, we have strictly regulated the disposal and movement and storage of waste, so that we are preventing creation of many new Superfund sites, new contaminated sites, through tight regulation on the movement of waste. So the key on slide 7, the next slide, the key RCRA provisions, subtitle C includes provisions on corrective action for facilities with permits. Subtitle D involves regulation of solid waste, the non-hazardous waste. And then subtitle I addresses underground storage tanks. And then, of course, there are regulations under each of those sections of RCRA. The next slide, slide 8, discusses the process for state authorization. Many of the US states are authorized by EPA to take primary responsibility for implementation of RCRA. And this process of state authorization by EPA ensures consistency across the states and minimum standards. The next slide discusses RCRA enforcement and just outlines some of the types of violations that come up in enforcement cases: operating without a permit, or violating requirements in RCRA or in the regulations that were issued under RCRA, violating the terms of a permit. And there's also a broad provision prohibiting endangerment of human health or the environment. So those are the types of violations that we sometimes find, and sometimes we'll bring a case on and we'll find the violator. The next slide, slide 10, goes into how we learn about potential violations. And there are several methods: inspections, reporting requirements, information requests. Sometimes we hear about a violation from a state agency or a local agency, and sometimes the public will report a potential violation to us. And then in all of these cases, we will gather information and determine whether to take enforcement action against the violator. Okay, the next slide. Sometimes we find out a problem when it's too late to prevent soil contamination. So how do we clean up sites that are already contaminated? And this is where we use the Superfund law, the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, CERCLA. The next two slides deal with different types of actions under CERCLA. So slide 12 deals with removal actions. Those are the quick actions, which we usually take when there's an immediate hazard that does not require a lot of evaluation to figure out this is something very dangerous. We don't have a lot of time to study the problem. We simply need to remove it. So this is, for example, often a removal action can be removing abandoned drums, barrels of contaminated waste or explosive material. No time to figure out exactly what's going on. We know we just need to remove it and treat the waste properly somewhere other than where it's sitting, because it's endangering the community. And then slide 13 goes into the other main type of CERCLA response action, which is a remedial action. A remedial action is a long-term cleanup. These often take years of study to determine the appropriate method of cleanup. And unfortunately, in our system, this may take a decade or more to complete. The next slide simply addresses the question of how clean does a site have to be after you clean it up? And we have some what we call sort of rules of thumb or guidance on how clean a site should be. The next slide, slide 15, looks at the process for these cleanups in a little more detail. And we start with a site-specific risk assessment. And that then, we use that information to determine the appropriate level of cleanup. And we have some screening levels, regional screening levels that are considered as part of the risk assessment. These are soil cleanup levels to protect that are set at a level that protects people from exposure to soils as well as to protect the groundwater. And then there's another kind of level for groundwater called maximum contaminant levels. The next slide, slide 16, looks at the issue that not all cleanups are to the same level, right? Sometimes we'll clean a site up clean enough that people could live there. Other times, maybe the site is too contaminated, the contamination is too extensive. It would be too expensive to clean that up to a residential standard. So we may just clean it up to an industrial standard. You could put a parking lot there, for example, but you could not put a house there. And then the next slide, 17, goes into the expense of cleanup. 70% of Superfund remedial actions are cleaned up by the responsible parties. And EPA will only fund cleanups when the responsible parties cannot do so, either because the company is bankrupt, they no longer exist, and sometimes in rare occasions when a company really does not have the ability to pay for the cleanup, they're too small of a company, then sometimes we will settle that out. The next slide goes into the different categories of liable parties. Could be the owner, could be the operator of the site, could be the generator who arranged for the disposal of the waste, or it could be the transporter of the waste. And then the next slide goes into liability, which is really the key of CERCLA, is holding the companies liable. It's strict liability. We don't have to show you were at fault. We just have to show that you arranged for the disposal, or that you're the owner or you're the operator of the facility. It's retroactive. Even contamination that occurred prior to enactment of CERCLA, a company is still responsible. And it's what we call joint and several liability. Each party is liable for the entire cost. But then it can be apportioned if we have a bunch of parties in the mix. So who decides who pays? Well, EPA starts with an investigation to identify the responsible parties. Sometimes they're obvious, sometimes we need to dig a bit to figure out who are the responsible parties. I think that I should have mentioned, I'm going to leave it there because my colleague, Ken Patterson from EPA Enforcement Office, will be with us on Thursday to talk more about how the CERCLA, the Superfund law, provides incentives for companies to clean up contaminated sites. So I'm going to leave it there for now, and we'll come back to this issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve. And thank you all the three panelists for your brilliant presentation. We have seen one question show up, and we will be happy to, we will continue to collect more questions before we throw them to the panelists in about 30-40 minutes. And then now we're going to move to discussion. And I will start to pose questions to use my moderator's rights, privilege, to pose questions to my favorite speakers. And And speakers, if you feel you have anything to add, to interrupt, to make any intervention, please just do so. But it will help me if you can just raise your hand through the video or in the chat, so I can moderate it to avoid people speaking overlapping each other. And audience, again, the Q&A session is open. Please feel free to type your questions and comments and remarks, ideally addressing to one or a few speakers, so the question can be more targeted. You can also type in Chinese if that's more convenient for you. Yeah, okay, so if I understand it correctly, again, thank you for all three of you for your brilliant presentation. I think in the three countries and the regions we just covered, China, the US, and the EU, there are some fundamental rules that we all share. That would be prevention comes first, and prevent if we can. Then if we have to do something to treat the contaminated land, we need to identify them, we need to register them, we need to monitor them. The entire the data system should be in place, and then we should also have a very clear liability mechanism in place to decide who's going to pay. And it seems all three countries and regions have this polluters pay as a fundamental principle. So to just set the record straight, I would just start by raising this question to all of you. So when we talk about soil remediation, some of you also mentioned underground water and the site remediation. Is this a very specific issue that we're talking about, only targeted at the soil, like in front of the surface of the earth? Or do we sometimes also cover the ecosystem in around, the underground water, the river? What's the practice? What's the scope of the issue we're talking about here in each of the country in the region that we are discussing here? And then if you could share any of your insights, some of the insights on the differences of financing soil and underground water, or let's say in China's case, financing soil remediation and air pollution. What are the different difficulties and differences in dealing with different ecosystems? Shall we start with, do we have any volunteers? Mr. Muller raised a hand. Please, Mr. Muller, go ahead.
Thank you. Well, to look for the history in where soil pollution stems from, what I told you about the European programs is very much dedicated to industrial contamination and or let's say to any economic activities, whereas what we always call kind of site pollution. And where we by purpose, that's also why our network names itself contaminated land. So it's not only the topsoil, but it's also the water resources we need to recognize and look for the impacts there. In terms of a different mode of pollution, that's what we in Europe have a distinction for diffuse pollution, which is usually kind of the origin by agriculture. So there's very much pesticides and nutrients in there, but as well there could be several sources of airborne sources and atmospheric deposition, which primarily touches then on the topsoil, which is the most difficult in terms of liability, because if you have multiple sources, you will hardly get a divide in between the liability, and that's the most trickiest for us.
Thank you, Mr. Muller. I'm not sure if it is Professor Dongzhan from back. Steve, do you have anything to add on this point, on the scope?
Yes, I would echo the points that were just made, and simply refer people to, we have at EPA, we have a handbook of groundwater protection and cleanup policies for RCRA corrective actions. So I think you're right to identify groundwater as being a very important problem, but also a very complex one to determine who's responsible for contamination of groundwater, and then the cleaning up of groundwater is also very complex. So I'm going to put a link in the chat to the EPA handbook for groundwater protection and cleanup policies. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And here, while waiting for Professor Dong Zhanpeng to rejoin us, we also have Dimitri de Boer from Client Earth, the China chief representative of Client Earth in the Beijing office. Maybe Dimitri has something to share with us on that front. We'll make a few remarks.
Thank you, Hongqiao. So yes, at Client Earth, we mainly focus on the legal aspects of environmental issues, and soil contamination and cleanup is a particularly lucrative subject for many environmental lawyers in the US and in Europe because the disputes around them tend to be so expensive that it's a very popular subject. But that's not what we focus on. We're much more interested in the discussion that we're having today. Sort of how do you design the legal system, and how do you make sure it's enforced properly in order to have an effective system for prevention and actually mitigating the risks. So I'll open by saying I'm not an expert, but I've participated in quite a lot of exchange visits and trainings and discussions and studies on soil remediation. So I'll just share a few comparative views, between what I've seen in Europe and the United States and also in China. I think basically in China, both prevention and cleanup need a lot of attention. They should be top priorities. In the last couple of years, air pollution and water pollution and now carbon and ecology have all had a lot of attention, which is really, really excellent. But soil contamination is an extremely serious issue, and it's extremely costly as well. And I'm very concerned that there may be many undiscovered issues and also many issues that are still happening and still emerging around the country. So in terms of prevention, there are so many high-risk industries in China, right? The pesticides and chemicals, leaking, landfills, incinerators, mining, heavy metals. The list goes on and on. I mean, all of these industries are largely things which perhaps used to be in Europe and the United States, and you have moved to China. And so essentially, the risk is now here. The systems for multi-stakeholder governance in China tend to be a bit weaker. And it's definitely necessary, especially when we talk about prevention, that you have, as many mechanisms as possible to discover problems and potential problems, and systems for disclosure, public participation, and especially access to courts when it comes to preventing a risk are still quite weak, actually, in China. So, even though now we have so many environmental court cases in China, they tend to be focused on existing pollution rather than preventing new pollution from occurring. And so that's something that I think really should be prioritized if we're going to address and prevent soil contamination. So all the prosecutors now in China, there are whole teams that specifically focus on public interest litigation. And I believe that we've been studying with them actually systems for preventive litigation, so that they can actually bring cases when there's a risk of environmental harm occurring. I think from the discussion today, it really strikes me that soil contamination should be a priority for them. They should be going around the country looking for these types of risks where failure to manage properly could lead to soil contamination, because it could be 100 times, 1,000 times more expensive to clean it up rather than trying to prevent it. In terms of existing contamination problems in China, again, I find it a very concerning topic. What we're seeing again, with the court cases in China as they play out, it's difficult right now for soil cases to really get through. The big problem is that it's in the Chinese system for public interest litigation, it's based on tort law. And so that means that you need to you have to identify exactly what the damage was to the environment and quantify it. And what we're seeing in other countries is that it's just very difficult to quantify the cost of the remediation for soil remediation. So you can't just go into the court and say, oh, you know what, Steve Wolfson polluted my land and it costs, 1 million, right? You don't know that. You can maybe identify Steve, but you don't know if it's going to cost 1 million or what. And so that process currently is just difficult in the way that Chinese environmental courts deal with these cases. It could be really helpful to have some kind of a modification there to the process, because currently, who's going to pay for figuring out exactly how much it is polluted, how much it's going to cost to clean it up? If that cost is on the plaintiff, right, then I can't afford it. Nobody can afford it. NGOs can't afford it, right? And the prosecutors would also be hard pressed to pay for all that, because they've got a lot of resources, but this costs a lot of money. So there needs to be some system here where that can be addressed. I'm a little worried in the Chinese context that perhaps very often government will end up paying for cleaning up soil contamination because of the way things work in China. And that really isn't right in my view. I mean, very often there are parties that can be held liable, and they should be held liable. The polluter pays, and that should be reflected in the balance sheets of these companies. And that's the signal that goes to the financial markets. Currently, what we're seeing in China is that the highest, what we call the most severe court cases, right? So the most expensive court cases in China are much lower, much less expensive than they are in the United States or in Europe. And that means that so financial people, investors, they don't really consider environmental risks a financial risk, because it never comes back to bite them. You don't see these billion-dollar court cases here, right? But they should, right? And if government ends up paying for it, it's really unfair. I mean, that doesn't make sense. So I guess my points are all of those. There's a lot of work to be done. It should be a big priority, and Client Earth is, of course, very happy to help study the relevant laws and regulations and enforcement mechanisms in China, and to support such exchanges as we're having today. My colleague Van Danting also looked into some specific recent court cases in China. So if we want to, maybe at a later stage in the session, we could go to her and let her give us a few examples of how these things actually played out in China.
Yes, thanks, Dimitri. Let's hold the comment on the specific case, the sharing of the specific cases in the later stage, because Professor Dong Zhanfang just rejoined us again. And Professor Dong, we were discussing, just to recap, give you a recap, we were discussing a few shared common grounds in China, US, and EU, and all speakers were talking about prevention. What's your take on that?
Great.
And if you could share with us a little bit on soil contamination, the remediation compared to air and the water. Yes, please.
Okay, I will share with you some of my opinions and observations. First, soil pollution prevention and control is a very important issue, and our priority in soil pollution prevention and control is pollution first. So we have to take a preventative measure to prevent pollution from occurring, or else we will pay a heavy cost. Well, in the past, the soil pollution prevention and control was not put on the agenda, but now there is the soil pollution prevention and control law, which has clarified the major principles of pollution prevention and control. So that's the positioning of our work in soil pollution prevention and control. And second, prevention should always come first. But of course, prevention itself alone is not enough. Prevention must be combined with control, and we should have the whole life cycle mentality. In terms of soil pollution prevention and control, in the overall management system, all those ideas are fully integrated into the system. So we have to strengthen the soil pollution risks, and there is a classified soil pollution risk management system. So there is already a basic system for soil pollution prevention and control, and the next step is to further improve this system to generate greater results and outcomes. And second, about water and air pollution prevention and control. Yeah, in comparison, soil contamination and pollution are more hidden, and soil rehabilitation and remediation is really expensive and time-consuming. There are many challenges in soil remediation compared with air and water pollution prevention and control, and it takes time for us to see the results in soil remediation. In China, for water, air, and soil pollution prevention and control, if we look at them in comparison, first, compared with air and water pollution prevention and control, soil pollution prevention and control lags behind. And of course, for water and air pollution, the major work focuses on enhancement of the air quality and water quality. But for soil remediation and soil pollution prevention and control, the priority is in pollution prevention. But for air and water pollution control, the priority is to enhance the quality of air and water. So that's my second observation. And the third observation is that the soil pollution prevention and control capacities, including the policy support capacities and technical capacities, are weaker compared with the water and air pollution prevention and control. China has already started soil remediation and pollution prevention and control, but we are still lacking many policies. We need more policies to be replaced. And many regions and places that haven't established the soil remediation funds. And of course, we need effective financing mechanisms. We have to develop innovative financing mechanisms for soil remediation. And we do not see very effective models at the local level. And in terms of water and air pollution prevention and control, the technologies are pretty mature. In air, and there is the supercritical emission of pollutants from some industrial systems. So we have very mature technologies for water and air pollution prevention and control. Professor Dong. Okay. That's from the moderator. So there are different features in the prevention and control of pollutants for soil, water, and air. In terms of damage compensation, the Chinese government attaches great importance to this issue. In around 2015, the Chinese government started to move forward with the development of the alcohol damage compensation system. For example, there is the basic law in the environmental protection, the environmental protection law, which specifies the eco compensation system. And there is a system of a technical guideline. And once there is a pollution, according to that guidance, you know how to evaluate the damage and how to provide compensation. But of course, there is a lot of room for further improvement. And when compensations are provided, you can bring your claims to local governments or some legal institutions. And there are some good cases in this aspect, but we have to make the compensation system more reasonable and more fair. The further reforms and improvement are needed. Professor Dong, I'm sorry to interrupt. So we have to think about the scope of eco compensation for soil pollution and the standard of compensation and the workflow, the procedure, and the process of eco compensation for soil pollution. And Professor Dong, thank you, moderator. Thank you. Yeah, that's all from me. Thank you, Professor Dong. Thank you for the very detailed and comprehensive explanations.
I actually want to pick up a point that Dimitri just mentioned about that. You know, it's very likely and it's concerning that it might end up that the Chinese government would pay him for all the cost of soil remediation. And I want to pose this question to both Steve and Mr. Muller. On this, what suggestions or what recommendations you might have? And I mean, of course, when you share any opinions combined with your experience in your region, in your own practice, how can we bring up private sector and to avoid that the government will just be the one to pay for everything that probably shouldn't be paid? Steve, would you like to start?
Yes, sure. I think for me, there's two parts to the answer to that. The first part is that while it's best to avoid having the government pay, it's best to have the polluter pay. There are nevertheless going to be some instances when the government is forced to pay, right? Because the companies don't exist anymore. And the idea is to make the amount of times that happens as small as possible. But the other part of that is even when the government pays, there may be a way to have the government get that money from the polluters, right? And this was the concept behind the original Superfund in our Superfund law. For those sites where the government pays, we created a fund for the government to use by taxing the industries that were creating the hazardous waste sites. So it was a tax on chemical feedstocks, right? The basic ingredients that go into the products, the making of which generates the hazardous waste. So by taxing those companies, we were able to create a fund that we were able to use for cleaning up the sites where we could not find the responsible party, could not get them to clean it up. So I think that's one way to sort of inject the polluter pays principle into even the situations where the government is the funder of cleanup, the funder of last resort for the cleanup. But we do want to use the law to minimize those cases and to make it so that most of the time, the actual companies that created the problem will clean up. And this is where I think it's an interesting point that Dimitri made about, well, and all the speakers have made about how complex it is to figure out how contaminated is the site, where did the contamination come from, who is responsible. The other thing, the second thing that our Superfund law does is to try to simplify these questions. And it's still very, very, very complex. But these issues are so complex that they need to be simplified in order to be dealt with. And so that's why, you know, the basic approach for polluter pays under CERCLA is to find a responsible party. And they are then responsible for all of the costs of the cleanup legally. That creates an incentive for them to help us find the other responsible parties, right? Because they don't want to pay for the whole cleanup. They want to share the cost among the other companies that are responsible. So even if it's not obvious to us who those companies are, the way the liability rules work, by holding the first company we find responsible for the whole cost, that gives them an incentive to help us find who the other companies are. They may have more information about who was responsible for contaminating a particular site than we do. So that's this idea of joint and several liability. It's also the case, it may be the case that we know, you know, which three companies created the contamination, but two of them don't exist anymore. They've gone bankrupt. And so it falls to that one company that's still going to pay for the costs. So it, you know, it is a system that depends quite a bit on the court system. And this, of course, is one of the disadvantages of CERCLA, is that by using liability rules to force companies to clean up, there's the potential for a tremendous amount of litigation. One way that we manage that is we went ahead and brought the cases and won a lot of the first few cases. And we found that when you establish a track record, right, when you establish that idea that, well, if you contaminate a site, we're going to find you and we're going to hold you responsible, you, the company, for the whole cost of cleaning it up. We found that after winning a few cases, the companies didn't want to litigate every case anymore. And now it's very, very rare that they litigate a case because they know our rules, they know our approach, and they know we're going to win in court if we follow our usual approach. So they only litigate the cases where something very strange has happened, for the most part. Usually the companies involved will settle the case to avoid the cost of litigation on top of the cost of cleanup. And I think that my colleague, Ken Patterson, on Thursday will be able to explain this in more detail. But we find that if we get all of the responsible parties in a room together, they will work out how to share the costs. And we have some guidance on how to do that in terms of, well, how many barrels of waste did you send to the site? What was in the barrels? Were the barrels in good condition when you sent them, or were they leaking? How toxic is the stuff that was in the barrels that you sent? And you combine all of these factors, and we have guidance on doing this. You combine all these factors and figure out how to apportion the costs. Sometimes we provide a mediator, or we encourage the parties to hire a mediator to help them sort through that and come to an apportionment of the cost. But one of the things that provides an incentive for the companies to work it out is they know, sort of hanging over them the whole time that they're meeting, is that EPA can sue them and force them to clean up, and that, or we can clean it up and then send them the bill. And that may be more expensive than if they do it themselves. They just might be more efficient. So there are all these incentives to get companies to actually resolve the problem. And it's still very complex, but we have some rules in our laws to minimize the complexity or manage the complexity.
Thanks, Steve. I think your last point is very interesting. Actually, it's cheaper if the companies actually treat the soil themselves rather than going to court. And yeah, I know I promised Diomar and Mr. Muller to share a few points, but before that, just picking up your point when it comes to going to court, I would like to invite Ms. Fan from Client Earth to share some Chinese cases on that. And then we'll turn to Mr. Muller for some remarks. Please go ahead. Fan Danting.
Thank you, Hong Chao. Thank you. So I'm Fan Danting from Client Earth Beijing office, and I work as a green finance and climate lawyer. I just want to share two cases and demonstrate the power of central environmental inspection, as well as prosecutors' litigation in soil contamination cases, especially because they have very high efficiency and also strong investigation power. So they are playing an increasingly important role in soil contamination cases. So the first case conducted by the Central Environmental Inspection Team just happened last month during their inspection in Shandong province. So it concerns a leather factory, which is polluting a construction land. And now the land is gonna be converted to public use. So because the government is eager to put the land into public use, they give green light to the project. And the leather factory, although they polluted the soil, they hired an assessment company and falsified the test results. So although the soil has been polluted by a heavy metal called chromium-6, 六价镉, they falsified the results to pass the government approval, and the construction began. This case was discovered by the Central Inspection Team, and it is now ongoing and being investigated by them. My point about this case is that such an inspection can play a huge role where government are also breaching the law, because the cases might not be able to be litigated by NGOs nor by individuals. And the central inspections can be greatly important to bring the governments into disciplinary or even to the court. Those inspection teams, they're led by environmental officials, also prosecutors and party disciplinary inspectors. And they pay visits to national authorities, to provinces, and to major SOEs to investigate into the most serious environmental issues. And this is a very unique but also efficient way in China to bring the polluters and the government back to their track, and also to remediate the pollutions they've done. So another case is done by the prosecutors, and it happened in Chongqing. So farmers have been reporting crops dying in their villages. And the Chongqing prosecutors, they began to investigate, and they're very quick. They only took 1 month to discover who is the polluter. And it happened to be the local railway companies, because they're using illegal industrial pesticides and kill all the crops, also contaminated the soil along the railroads. And very quickly, they asked the companies to remediate, and also to help to reach compensation agreements for the farmers. Apart from that, they also help form remediation plans by consulting the experts from the universities and the agricultural department. So also the prosecutors have issued pre-trial recommendations to these companies to ask them to change their behavior and make sure that such pesticides will not be used in the future. Otherwise, they will be brought into the court. So those two cases, you can see them as like quasi-judicial cases, because they haven't been brought to the court yet. However, they can be super important in preventing damages to enlarge, or even to prevent damage to happen in the first place. because they are efficient and they have strong investigation power, and they can also be kind of they can also issue warnings to the government directly and ask them to change behavior. So I just want to share those two cases on the unique systems in China, and we can see that they may play a hugely important and increasing role in soil remediation, also to play maybe a preventive role in soil pollution cases. So that's my sharing. Thank you, Hongqiao.
Thanks, Dantine. Yeah, as promised, I will direct this question to dear Mr. Muller. Thank you for your patience. I was about to ask you about the question, how to avoid the situation of government being forced to pay for the remediation cost. And it just occurred to me, and I would like to invite a colleague to share again your last PowerPoint slides on the public-private mix, the funding mix in the EU project. I think that's the next slide. I don't have it. There was a chart, maybe. Okay. Anyway, it's probably lifted from this slide. Based on our previous conversation, private conversation, I think you showed a mix of finance mix of public and private funding in some countries, such as Norway, Finland, and Switzerland. We've seen very high proportion of public finance in soil and site remediation, up to sometimes 60 to 85%. It's an astonishing number for me, at least. Could you give us some more insights on what happened there and why there's such a high level of public funding in these countries, while in some other countries, for example, in Portugal, Latvia has much higher share of EU funds, and in some other countries, I don't remember the specific names, but have more participation of private funds. How and why the funding sources in these countries are so different from each other? And can you give us insights on that, please?
Well, in a very generic way, there's simply a difference in the history of pollution and the history of jurisdictions. So if you look for Europe, there is, for example, with 1989, the fall of the Iron Curtain, which means that a lot of East European countries were former state-owned companies, caused a lot of contamination. Then, of course, there it is very much in public budgets. If you go for Portugal, then it's more a question of I would say that's a different story or a different example, because it was more the European regional funds which tried to strengthen a not so strong economy in the 70s, 80s, 90s in Portugal to get stronger and catch up with the rest of Europe. So that's really, in general terms, we need to be specific and look for a mixture of financing and be clear on the sources. And in discussing, watching the discussions so far, I would put it under, if we want pollution prevention and we want polluters pays principle, and then put it even more general, then it's something about the internalization of environmental costs, what our societies are suffering for. And the public budget should always be the fallback position only. Yeah. But that's something we are all still striving for, and we are not there. So what is important is having a legal frame in pollution prevention. So what I also put to the chat, and then also you could do it to the participants, there is also under the European Green Deal a new ambition for the Zero Pollution Action Plan, which then defines specific targets, and not only for soil, but connected to water and air. Please have a look. So that's really informative. We want to shape it for the next years until 2027. In terms of incentives, coming back what Steve expressed, taxation, yeah, that's what a lot of European countries also have been doing, also my country. So when we discussed 30 years ago the origin of contamination, and then there was finally a political decision also for waste taxation. That might be a different decision today, but at that time, that was more or less the biggest, understood as being the biggest polluter, and then to raise a fund there, and the fund is really then not covering, our national fund, for example, doesn't cover then 100%, but tries to create an incentive as well, where a liable or non-liable party could come in for funding up to 90%. But it still means they need to cover also costs, and they should do it for, so not we as environment agency or the ministry is in charge, but they are. Furthermore, again, coming back to the idea of internalization of environmental costs, there was the example of the Environmental Liability Directive, which on the one hand really had the idea in the background that it may attract the insurance sector to provide insurance products for big industries in case of pollution. Yeah? So that's still also something one could put on a list if one discusses possibilities for financing. And there are even more simple mechanisms like simply in taxation, that you have some tax advantages if you voluntarily remediate a site or an area. Well, finally, to end my statement, I want to subscribe that in a systemic approach, beside the financing and beside the legal framing, the environmental controls, as raised before, so environmental inspections and also the prosecutors, they need to be there. There need to be the possibility for punishment as well. So that's from my side.
Steve, do you have anything to add on that point? I guess if I have to make a remark, I would raise this question: is public funds enough? Will public funds ever be enough if we don't have, a functional mechanism to make sure that polluters pays, that government doesn't have to be forced to pay? And in that context, can we raise more public finance to support the orphan sites, remediation, and among others? That's my question, but I guess Steve might have different answers to what, a response to what you just said. Steve, if you want to add anything.
I think the companies have the deep pockets, and the companies are responsible for the pollution. So I do think it's very helpful to have a way to require the responsible companies to do the cleanup. And maybe part of simplifying the issues to get to where you can do that, part of it is, I think, goes back to the point that Dimitri made, that it's maybe not feasible to always stick with a kind of a tort law approach. We're looking for, precise proof of causation and very precise apportionment of the responsibility when there may be a number of companies that are responsible partially in a way that really can't be sorted, how much each company is responsible. And that's why a simple rule, each company is responsible for the whole thing, but then having guidance so that the companies or EPA, if it falls to us, can work out how to apportion that responsibility. But to not spend all the time worrying about how responsible is each company, but really to put the emphasis, excuse me, on getting the site cleaned up and getting the companies to pay for it. It's hard to imagine the government ever having enough funding for the public finance to pay the entire cost of cleaning up. And one of the fears is that if we rely too much on the government to do the cleanups, then there won't be enough, there won't be as many cleanups. They won't happen as quickly or as extensively as they need to in order to protect the communities near them. But there are always going to be some cases where you cannot get the company to clean up, and then you need some public funding, but I'd hate to see it all fall to public funding.
Thank you, Steve. Steve, there's a question for you in the Q&A session from Knut Alfsen. I'm not sure if I pronounced it correctly. Excuse me if I didn't. Steve, is it a problem that certain polluted sites becomes untouchable, leaving, for example, downtown sites unsellable and unusable? And what were the solutions? And what should we deal with that? What's the experience in the US? Steve.
We have a program called the Brownfields Program for putting former industrial sites back into use, cleaning up providing incentives for new companies to come in and clean up the pollution and then put the site to use. But the brownfields approach is really only feasible for lightly contaminated sites. The more heavily contaminated sites, we really need to either find the companies that were responsible and make them clean it up, or clean it up using public funding. But we can't just leave heavily contaminated sites in the middle of an industrial city. This will hurt the economy of that city quite a bit. So there needs to be a cleanup, and that's why we have the system where the first choice is the polluter pays, but if the companies no longer exist, we're going to use public funding to clean the site up. So I guess my answer would be we can't really afford to treat any site as untouchable.
Yes, thank you, Steve. I hope this answers your question, Knut. Professor Dong is back. 董教授，董教授您在吗？
Well, Professor Dong, are you there?
董教授，请问您在吗？对，我刚刚是想请您分享一下中。
I would like to ask you to share in terms of the financing innovation for soil remediation in China. You talk about these liability insurance for the polluters. We discussed these insurance and other financial innovation. Can you elaborate? Please also try to be brief, maybe 2 or 3 minutes. Thank you. Well, the insurance can be applied in the soil remediation, and I think this is just at the beginning in China. And the key is how we can really mobilize the incentives of the different stakeholders and actors, and the institutional design. We have not got a better solution yet, because the regulator and the Ministry of Ecology and Environment, they actually think from it from an administrative perspective. But for the insurance company, they need to have a profit margin and a business model. So for the enterprises, if there's no mandatory requirement, then if they just voluntarily buy the insurance products, they don't have enough incentives to buy the insurance products either. So that is the situation. Therefore, the insurance instrument has been not well used in the soil remediation. Some regions are doing some exploration, but we haven't got very effective models yet in China. But in my opinion, in the next step for the soil remediation, insurance instrument should be a very important product, because soil remediation, this is actually a part of the risk control and management. Therefore, insurance inherently has this sort of nature and properties or features that is quite applicable to soil remediation. But how can we really streamline and incentivize all the different actors and stakeholders and have a really good policy design to incentivize the insurance industry and also the enterprises. And you also talk about green bond and green finance to provide financing for soil remediation projects. Can you also elaborate on that? So regarding the green finance, well, in China, we really highlighted this, and for soil remediation, it really takes a very big amount of investment. So if we only rely on the public budget and local government, it's not enough. So financial institutions and financial markets is very important. In China, in terms of the credit and insurance, bond, and fund, there are some kind of exploration and use of these credit and the bond and fund and insurance to some extent in soil remediation projects. So in some areas, they have put in place a database of the projects, and then the financial institutions provide some support. For example, some credit support. The Jiangsu province is a good example in this case. They have done it very well. And in terms of the bonds, so this is a kind of a bonds to a municipality or bonds to a corporate, to a company. But this really depends on the specific situation. Some regions, some municipalities already have some debt issues. So some regions have issues on bonds, but use the bonds, but in some regions they have not. And then in terms of the fund, well, this is something that we really need to make use of. But right now, in different areas, people also have different opinions about the fund. At the national level, well, these funding platform and this funding pool should be very important. So public finance and also the finance from the financial sector and private sector can be pulled together in a pool and then used in the soil remediation. But different regions actually have different understanding, and some have done pretty well, but some have not really made the initial foray yet. Well, and then in terms of the insurance, I talk about it. Now it's still at the infant stage, and there are many issues to be addressed before we can really let insurance play the role.
I think some of the discussion we already had somewhat answered one of the questions raised in the Q&A session, which is what are most innovative soil remediation technologies and approaches. You could refer to best practices, and also, most projects, the finance come from public funds in the government budget. Are there any opportunities for options to fund soil remediation by private funds and sources? And just for the consideration of time, I would just turn to each of you, Steve, Dietmar, and maybe Dimitri too, to give a few, let's say, keep your answer very short and brief, 2 to 3 minutes on the above two questions. And let's go with the second question first. What do you think are the opportunities? Where are the opportunities and options to fund soil remediation by private funds and sources in your context? And what might be, future opportunities in addition to what Professor Dong just shared with us, what's happening in China? Steve, would you like to go ahead? And then I'll return to Mr. Muller.
I'm happy to start, but I don't think I have a very satisfying answer. I think, this is the question of, in part, this is the question of how well does a method that is somewhat functional in the United States, operates a bit differently in Europe, but also pretty functional there. But how well will that translate into the Chinese context and Chinese legal system? And this is an area I was talking about liability rules as the main source of incentive for US companies that are responsible for contamination to clean it up. Whether that will work in China is very much an issue of how the Chinese legal system is evolving in the environmental law context. And it's not at all clear, that these things can be simply transplanted from one system to another. But what I can say is, we have a method that, although it's expensive and involves litigation and a lot of expense, we have a method that is somewhat functional to address the problem. And of course, it is a very difficult problem to put the cost of cleaning up contaminated sites on the polluters who are responsible for those contaminated sites. It's not just complex because the government, is inefficient. It's complex because the problem is complex. So we have a system for doing that. I would say, look at the guidance that I referenced in the chat. Consider my colleague Ken Patterson on Thursday will do a bit of a deeper dive from his experience as an enforcement lawyer, as a prosecutor, in effect, on how these cases work, and consider whether that method is useful for China to consider. And maybe there are adaptations that would need to be made to make it work in China. But that's the system that we have. That's the system that we know. And it does take care of the majority of the cleanup costs, although there's always, that residual amount where we cannot find the companies where public funding is used to clean up the sites. So I hope that helps get us started anyway.
Thank you, Steve. Mr. Muller, dear Thomas, please.
Thanks. Well, here I also echo what Steve is expressing. First, I admit I'm not familiar with the background in China and the jurisdiction, but even comparing the US and Europe, there are differences. And but to come closer is then for how to release more private financed soil remediation. It's well, the usual approach here around was probably when we figured out a dilemma situation, all these dilemma situation, to have either the polluter paying or the public, that the primary solution was really tend to look for cooperation in between the public and the private sector. So whatever it then comes down to a funding program or to a sector-specific program. So that was a quite usual solution. Obviously, I think is that the strongest financial mechanism is taxation. So by taxation, on the one hand side, you may create a fund, a money pot you can run, and on the other hand, you have other effects to get a lowerage in waste disposal or whatever you intend. So taxation usually is a strong instrument. Future opportunities, like raised before, the experience in Europe around the Environmental Liability Directive are not really a success. So the private sector, the insurance sector, or the industry didn't really refer to. So it didn't come true. It simply said that new financial products govern now the market. And finally, in terms of green finance, yes, there are also ongoing activities here in Europe. So there we have a new European regulation which directs towards green finance. So the European taxonomy regulation. Well, of course, not any clue or experience or forecast how successful it will be to drive investments for a better greening or to avoid greenwashing. Does this answer your question, hopefully somehow?
I'm quite satisfied. I don't know about Iskandar, who raised the question. I will turn to Dimitri first before I raise a second round of question? Dimitri.
Thank you. Well, I wanted to share a story of a very interesting contracting model that I came across in Europe. So a very large consultancy company had a team that was very strong in soil remediation and also the assessment. And what they did was that they would be willing to agree on a flat fee with a developer, for example, to say, okay, they would go in and do some testing and all that, and then they would say, okay, we are willing to to make sure that you can develop your land for this particular purpose, and we'll handle all the remediation, and you just pay us this amount and we'll have it ready by that day, and if not, the consultancy company would have all sorts of penalties. So they would take on the risk basically, for a flat fee, and the way, because they were confident to do that because they had such a strong team of soil remediation experts, right? So they would go in and test and be confident that they could do this, and then they would take on this risk. And so I think that's a really interesting model because the way he described, he said, we'll win on 9 projects, we might lose on 1. And in the end, they do good business, right? And I think a big part of this is the sort of confidence, right, and the expertise. If the expertise, like in this case, the expertise takes on the risk because they're confident that they can get there, and all the other parties, right, the government or the developer or they all, once they gain confidence in that model, it can actually really help to get more remediations done and to get more sites redeveloped. So I thought that was an interesting story to share.
Thank you, Dimitri. If there's no more questions coming up from the audience, I will just send around I will invite the remaining speakers to give some of your final thoughts on this topic. You can share whatever you think is the most important takeaway for our audience, the challenges, the obstacles, the outlook ahead. Keep your answer short. And I, again, thank you very much for your inputs and insights. Who wants to go first? Steve again? Just stick with this sequence. I'm sorry. We give you the last spot to speak. So, you get the first to speak in the Q&As.
I maybe gave away the punchline or created a spoiler before, because I would simply repeat that point that this is a complex problem in environmental law, in part because contaminated sites are so complex to identify the sources of the contamination and to clean them up. And so it's not an easy task to solve this problem. And that's why, we're talking about all these different approaches and models, and maybe at the end, we need a mix of some of these different solutions for different situations. But I am heartened to see that this is an issue of strong interest in China, in the environmental law community in China, which I've seen really emerge over the little more than 10 years that I've worked on issues with China on environmental law. I'm very heartened to see the development of the environmental law community and the expansion of interest, from 1 or 2 issues. We used to only talk about PM 2.5, and now we're talking about climate change and groundwater and chemical contamination and eliminating lead from paint and managing lead from battery recycling and emissions from smelters, and so many different issues that need to be addressed. So I'm glad to see that these issues are now all on the agenda and all getting attention. And I hope that with more of these kind of joint efforts, we can help to illuminate some of the ways to deal with these issues, because obviously there's a need for rapid action. And so anything that that we can share that can help move that along, we're happy to try to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Mr. Muller, it's your turn.
It's, well, kind of frustrating maybe that, well, I would join in and underpin what Steve expressed. So we're dealing with complexity and uncertainty, and there is no single answer. But putting it in another way is then it's really the thinking about that you need a systemic approach which covers from the policy part to legal issues to implementation, and that across different scales. Because soil pollution might be a small one at petrol station or rather complex sites. So, and that's really kind draws a big map of different challenges. Yeah, and there you need different approaches, like a lot of them have been discussed today. I also join what Dimitri expressed. There are business models here in Europe for private companies to take over the risks. And some of them are successful, but that's hardly something the public administration or science can enforce. That's really kind of knowledge makes it possible. To end up with maybe kind of a positive statement or where future opportunities could be is we are living in a changing world, and we're discussing transition in terms of the big threats to our planet, which are with the climate, which are with biodiversity. And that may create as well new visions for and programs to cope with those challenges. So under the European Green Deal, there will be specific actions and also financial programs to restore soils in terms of soil organic carbon, to really get kind of a carbon capture in soils. Yeah. And then you can completely refresh your thinking for going how to make your business model. The other thing likely is, well, if we want to be a carbon dioxide neutral world in some future, we will need to transform our energy sector completely, which then here in Europe, we are in a discussion for, so what is about the wind energy, what's about the photovoltaic plants, and what is the opportunities at contaminated sites to use them for producing energy, and to replace the old energy system. Yeah, hopefully this gives some hope for the future. So thank you.
Thank you. Yes, that's indeed the question we're asking us today. We're not just talking about the environment, soil contamination in an environmental setting, but also in the big context of climate change and biodiversity loss. And of course, in China, we've also seen a few pilots of using abandoned coal mines to install wind turbines and solar sets. Probably can provide a new business model for the future. And thank you very much for your remark. I will turn to Dimitri, please.
Thank you. I just want to say I thought it was a terrific discussion, and thank the organizers. I learned a lot, and it's very, very timely. So just a big thank you. Yeah, congratulations. Well done.
I would just say thank you again to all the speakers, panelists, and and all our participants from the audience. And I do encourage you to follow up for the session 2 and the session 3, in which we discuss a lot of issues that we haven't discussed here today. For example, filling the policy and the science gap, and how to scale up technology innovations and the business cases in both China and Europe, and of course in the US, to see some inspiring cases on the ground and maybe take lessons from them for solving our future challenges. And we will also go deep dive into a few different soil types, which we haven't really got a chance to do that in the first session. namely the industry, lands, mining, forest land, and agriculture, which is really one of the biggest issues in China when it comes to soil remediation. And we're probably bringing more discussion on climate, carbon sink, biodiversity, and of course, one of the most heated topic on nature-based solutions. I will just again say thank you to everyone. I encourage you to sign up for our session 2 and 3 to join us in following discussions. And Professor Dong, I guess we have to say goodbye to you, and we will keep the good conversation in the future. And thank you all, and enjoy a good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Thank you.